This is lecture 12 in the Introduction to Politics. I'll call this Statism and Internationalism. We've looked at thus far, in the beginning of this class, we looked at 4 approaches to Introduction to Politics. The one is looking at the important role of Canadian politics, and that can be explored in scientific way in terms of institutions and legislature and executive and parties and voting within the Canadian context itself. And then we've touched on comparative politics with its important role in not only thinking within one's own liberal democratic tradition and the variations within that, but also comparing liberal democratic traditions to other political traditions which don't stand within a liberal democratic heritage itself. Political theory, or political philosophy, which is important also. So often when we think of political science, as I mentioned in my first lecture, the danger is sometimes calling political science a scientific discipline, whereas it's pulled between scientific tendencies in which facts and objectivity is important, but also the humanities side of political science is not a science in that exact sense, just because of the ambiguity and the complex nature of what humans are and the unpredictabilities of those things. And so political philosophy or political theory is very important in studying that. And then the final one is international relations. And within the field of international relations, there are a variety of paths that can be taken in exploring what that means. So in this final phase of the course, we'll be looking at the importance of international relations and some of the key elements within that and some of the issues that have to be faced. The 16th century gradually saw a breakdown of what was called the Holy Roman Empire, in which there was a unified understanding, obviously tensions within the Holy Roman Empire, and people competing for who defined that and the role of the church and state in that clash and tension, and who had the upper hand, certainly in the Western intellectual tradition between church and state, Roman Catholic in the West, obviously, and then the various emperors that embodied that. But by the 16th century, with not only the fragmentation of the Christian church into multiple denominations, each of those denominations in time also became part of identifying with certain breakdown of the empire into certain states. And so the rise of nation states in the 16th, 17th century. As a result of that, various forms, denominational forms of Christianity tended to identify with certain states as they were emerging. And by the 17th century, sadly so and tragically so, the religious wars. And out of those religious wars emerged the Westphalian tradition of state sovereignty, in which a state within its borders and within its territories had the right to define which forms, in this case of Christianity, should be honored, or which combination of forms of Christianity should be honored. And no state had, in principle at least, the right to impose a form of religion on citizens within that country, recognizing there were diversity of interpretations of Christianity. So the Westphalian tradition gives us a notion, both at the level of religion and politics in international relations, of state sovereignty. Obviously, it wasn't secularism as we understand it today, or hard or aggressive, in which religion should be banished. This comes much later. It was just the notion that there should not be any integration between a state and a religion. There should be a separation, in this case, between church and state. And no form of Christianity had the right to determine how a state should view religion. This was being played out in the 17th, 18th centuries, and the Westphalian tradition was, as I mentioned, foundational to the rise of nation states and the independence of nation states and state sovereignty. And And as time obviously moves on, we get within international relations the clash between states. There's a rise of certain states which are aggressive, whether the French Revolution that emerges in the late 18th century, Napoleon attempting to become, in that sense, the new Holy Roman Empire, seeing himself as standing on the shoulders of another sort of collectivist notion of what Europe should be. The same thing happened Germany in the 20th century, and so there has been these movements within Europe itself uh, to transcend state sovereignty by aggressive powers. Napoleon, Hitler, there have been others as well. And in international relations, there is this tension between, on the one hand, honoring state sovereignty and that no one has the right to interfere in the internal affairs of another state, and then aggressive forms of cosmopolitanism, in which it's an attempt to revive almost the Alexander the Great, the Holy Roman Empire. And so this is where you get a clash between a certain type of aggressive cosmopolitanism and Westphalian tradition. Also within and so part of when we look at international relations, one of the big issues that inevitably comes up is the issue of war and peace, for the simple reason that where you have aggressive states, how do states deal with an aggressive state? How are alliances made, and how do these things take place to minimize the sheer tragedies of war? And we certainly know in the last few centuries, when war does take place, the carnage, the implications, the recovery of that that leaves people brutalized over periods of time. So in international relations, out of the war-peace issue becomes two ideologies. One is the issue of idealism, in which institutions are created, certainly in the 20th century, such as the League of Nations, which was an attempt to look at how can nations work together in a unified way for the greater good of states and people, with the best of human longings, intentions, organization, diplomacy, dialogue. On the other hand, the whole philosophy of realism, in which the argument is that politics is about power. It's about the balancing of power. It's about weighing stronger states off with weaker, and alliances are made throughout history to deal with this war-peace issue. So when we get into the philosophy of international relations, two of the big traditions are idealism and realism itself. Now, the study of international relations can also be excessively focused, just as in comparative politics, on first world states and comparing different types of liberal democracies. So in international relations, one wants to move out of just first world politics, or what's called developed states, into developing states or underdeveloped states, in first world, second world, third world, in the relationship of wealth and poverty. And what's then the role of states, international institutions, particularly the United Nations, the General Assembly, and many other arms of the United Nations, in some small way, in minimizing that gap between the tale of two cities, or wealthy, affluent first world states, developing and underdeveloped states. And so international relations, for those who are keen on pursuing that, will often take them down the pathway of wealthy states. How did they get their wealth? What's the history of that? How have they milked certain former colonies? What's been the relationship of first, second, third world, fourth world states? And how and why can some of those disparities or inequalities be overcome? So in the world of international relations, this becomes a very important area, comparing, drawing from history itself and the history between first, second, third, fourth world states, the reasons for the way the world is the way it is today, and can some of the disparities and the tragedies be overcome? And if so, how would that be done in many ways? Many international institutions have emerged in the area of international relations, not only that deal with war and peace, wealth and poverty, but trade becomes a key issue. So what's the relationship of the many organizations in international relations that deal with the relationship between the rise of multinational corporations or transnational corporations, which some have larger gross national products than many states in the world. And many will argue from the left, particularly, that the transnational corporations, or the larger ones, have seriously weakened the ability of states to deliver goods for citizens. People on the center right will argue it's not quite as simple as that. But there's also a very close relationship often between states and transnational corporations as well. And so looking at the economic industrial question of international relations, there's the whole issue of transnational corporations that transcend state interests. So those with an interest in economics, is the market economy, a free market economy, the best way to go to create a bumper crop world? Or does, in fact, a competitive market economy lead to the disparities that we have today? So we look at international relations and the economic question, the issue then becomes, what is the best way to create, rather than free trade, fair trade? And there's a variety of movements today that are concerned with fair trade rather than free trade, and how that takes place as well. Some of the larger international regional organizations that have emerged, politics, because it's argues that the sovereignty of Westphalian states is very limited in the world that we live in today. And so, for example, in Europe, the whole EU is seen as a key way of bringing together European states to protect them against what they see as other larger powers, and how do they work together for the greater good. And there's other regional organizations in Africa, Middle East, Latin America, that argue that regions can be stronger where states work together for the greater good. So in international relations, a person can follow, if they're interested, the whole area of regional organizations, the relationship to states themselves. International law is a significant area as well when we go into international relations, and the role of international courts and human rights, and the role of declarations and covenants, and the role of non-government organizations and government-assisted organizations and intergovernment organizations. So it's one thing to study the Westphalian tradition of states and regional organizations and international organizations, but what's the role of non-government organizations in the environment, such as Greenpeace, or human rights such as Amnesty International, or many other organizations themselves, which act as a conscience in many ways to states or regional organizations. And so in the study of international relations, some people choose to focus on these significant organizations that exist in one sense to challenge states when they're not true and faithful to what they're meant to be, or even regional organizations which are willing to compromise principles for power, and usually the human rights violations which occur as a result of that. So there's various directions a person can go when we think international organizations or international relations, anywhere from the larger philosophic discussions of various types of realism, because realism is not a one-dimensional philosophic interpretive position. Idealism is not also. There's been many thinkers who've tried to synthesize the best of idealism, the best of realism, and then, of course, the movement into the study of comparative states, first, second, third, fourth world. Another area, of course, is the study of indigenous peoples, whether it's in Canada, the United States, Europe, or many other parts of the Middle East, Latin America, Asia. And so this is a whole area also in international relations, which has become significant for those who are interested in going down that path, and how often in various countries the clash between a certain state policy and the relationship of First Nations people and land, and how they're treated by states which want to assimilate, essentially. And certainly Canada has participated in that dilemma as well as the United States and others. I'd mentioned in a previous micro lecture, I lived with the Sami for a time in northern Norway, particularly the mountain Sami, and the tensions they constantly had with, in this case, Norway, but it was the same issues of Sweden and Finland and Russia, with the constant pressures to assimilate into Scandinavian society. So in the area of international relations, this is a significant area of study also. And so when we enter into the broad world of international relations, which is very important, security obviously is one of those key issues. What are the organizations, as much and as far as possible, that can create some level of predictability and security, so that the world does not slip into sheer anarchism? Many will argue it is an anarchist world order. And what's the role of security in all of that? So this becomes a key area. And how is that provided? What are the organizations that do that? Certainly in First World, NATO and NORAD, these many organizations which are about military security, but security for who? Is it just for security for the First World? And what's the implications of those who question these large First World security organizations? And so international relations can cover a whole variety of interdisciplinary approaches. But as we move into the sphere of international relations, these are some of the pathways that can be taken that cover the wide range of philosophy, economics, that cover obviously religion and international relations. Very important, particularly people who are trained purely in a secularist approach to politics, international relations, comparative politics, political philosophy. It often leaves them inept and incompetent to understand why there are clashes in different parts of the world, of which religion plays a part. And so a healthy approach to international relations, particularly people trained well, should definitely have a significant training in the sacred and in religions itself, because they'll never understand some of the eruptions, the conflicts that are occurring in various parts of the world, if they don't understand the motivations of certain religious people as they clash with other religious people or with secularists, and the conflicts which emerge from that. And so international relations, people are trained well and maturely, and that should certainly have taken courses in religious studies to understand the relationship of religion and politics and some of the major and minor religions of the world as well. So as we go down this international relations, or IR pathway, those are some of the things to ponder as we take the steps and look at different parts of the world, the 5 major regions of the world, and some of the issues that have to be dealt with in such historic contexts.